Chris, how have you been enjoying Trumpocalypse 2? How you been feeling about things?
uh, you know, I don't know how old you are, Daniel, but at some point, I'm 63, and at some point in my 50s, I guess, uh, I realized that the question of like, how are you, started to become very complicated because there was no clear answer. It was always like, well, these things are good, and these things are not so good, and the other things, I have no idea how it's going to turn out. It's that old that saying about the Zen, where the
Yeah,
guy has the horse and falls off the horse, and I don't know.
yeah, 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 yeah,
I,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's how I feel. So it's like, well, the shit's hitting the fan, but on the other hand, the shit has needed to hit the fan for a long time now. So, is this a good thing, a bad thing? I don't know. I've been reading your analyses, and I agree with much of what you have to say about what's happening. I particularly appreciate, I got to say this, I just want to say this publicly. I really appreciate your willingness to sort of reassess your own assumptions and your previous beliefs about things. I think that's a very welcome and rare kind of intellectual humility, which I think if anything's going to save us, it's going to be something along those lines.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes, it can be a little bit painful to do it, but less painful than holding on to things that you no longer think are, plausible or true.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
it's the nature of growth is letting go, and there's always some sort of death involved. But yeah, I mean some of the things you've written about Charles Eisenstein and some of the other people you used to hang out with a lot. I assume a lot. I don't know. Um, Yeah, and the stuff around confusion around sexual dynamics and stuff is just like, wow, this guy's for real. This isn't someone just looking for attention. This is someone really working through significant, important thoughts publicly. So I appreciate that.
No, thank you. Yeah, I thought it'd be interesting to talk about sexuality a little bit, as it's such a major undertone of the situation. On so many, there's so many layers to it. I mean, there's sort of like, Andrew Tate, who got flown in from Romania to sort of be part of the sort of patriarchal toxic masculinity, like super squad.
Yeah,
Russell Brand finally got, I think, arraigned for sexual assault charges today. About 10 people sent me that article. Um, and then you have like sort of on one hand you have like insane sexual profligacy, like this woman, what's her name, Lily Ryan or something, who OnlyFans English lady who slept with 100 guys in a day or in 12 hours or something. And there was like a Vice film about it. Actually, Russell just interviewed her for his Rumble things. I was watching that. Then at the same time, you have like the rise of the trad wife and kind of this whole thing from like the Heritage Foundation that like we're going to go back to like strong family patriotism, God, family, and country, and
yeah.
women are going to get married at younger ages. There's not going to be abortion or contraception. I mean, what the hell is going on, Chris? Tell me about it.
You want me to answer all that at once, huh?
Yeah, well, I
Okay.
mean, yeah, what is, because I know you have a perspective on humanity as not ultimately being monogamous, and that's sort of like ill-fitting in the sort of garment of the nuclear family and the monogamous structure.
Yeah.
So, what do you? I mean, yeah, is it something that you're still tracking? Maybe it's not even a big focus of yours right now.
Oh yeah, I still track it. I'm still very interested in these sorts of developments. I'm not sure about the connection between all the things you mentioned. One thing I think is interesting, and it always strikes me when I read about this woman who had sex with 100 guys in a day or whatever it was, is they always use the phrase "slept with," and nobody was sleeping.
No.
We're still we're still using these strange evasive phrases for fucking, you know. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's I think it's sort of a global, general, unified field theory of what's happening. I feel like humans are. I just wrote about this in a recent Substack piece. Like humans are believing. We are, you know, we are designed to believe. Whether we're believing in our parents as kids that they're invincible and therefore we're safe, or we're believing in, you know, Deutschland über alles, or we're believing that Jesus loves us, or that God hates us, or, you know, that Allah is the supreme, you know, the one and only God, or whatever the hell it is, we have a need to believe. And the structures and the institutions in which we were believing, you know, when you and I were kids, they're all gone. They're all falling apart. And so, you know, the Catholic Church, Wall Street as a conservative place to put your money, the American dream, the supremacy and wisdom of the American military, you know, political leadership, uh, you name it. I can't think of a single institution that hasn't been exposed as corrupt and rotten at its core. And yet all this belief remains, this need, this hunger for credence remains. And so I think you know, it's like in economics they talk about when there's a lot of money flooding the markets, it's like a rat looking for a hole. It's looking for a safe place to go. People want to
Mm.
invest somewhere. They want to put the money somewhere, right? Because there's no interest being paid by the banks because there's so much capital. So people are looking for investments. I feel like that's what happens with belief. So people are looking for things to believe in. Um, and so you get cults. And I think our politics is essentially cult like behavior at this point. You know, it's not that people look at Donald Trump and say, I think he's a prudent manager. And, you know, I think he'll make wise decisions, you know, for you know, the good of the planet. They think he's the second coming of some sort, the ones who, you know, believe in him. So anyway, I feel like that's what's happening. And I feel like it's happening with Tradwife, with the family stuff, right? The nuclear family seems to have is falling apart. It's not a um, sort of a believable model anymore. So
Mm.
people are looking for, you know, polyamorous pods, or, you know, like trying all these different configurations, looking for a way that works. And of course, the hole I'm trying to scurry into is the whole of, you know, I guess you could say traditional values if you're talking about traditions of, you know, 20,000 years or more. You know, I feel like emotionally and socially, we should be taking the same guidance that we seem to be taking medically and in terms of diet, which is what works for our species, what has worked for our species for a long time, what are we evolved to sort of resonate with. That's going to be the guide toward where we're going to be most comfortable and most effective. So that's small scale community, that's, you know, local food, that's intimate relationships with people we're very close to and we've known, you know, we trust, we share, um, you know, share our resources and share our fate to some extent. So anyway, that's sort of my best attempt at answering your multifaceted question.
So yeah, I mean, it feels like in the last, you know, 8, 10 years, like a sort of collapse of social cohesion and collapse of coherent thinking. Like most people don't seem able to really reason logically in the way they used to, and that's led to people making a lot of like leaps in a way. And I don't know if that's just the result of social media and the algorithms and the outrage machine, as one guy called it in the book. Um, but or it's also maybe partially the result of kind of propaganda from Russia and other sources, QAnon and so on. But yeah, well, let's start with the bigger question. What gives you hope right now, and what are you most concerned about in what you see happening?
Well, I guess what gives me hope is what I was saying earlier, that at my advanced age, I have enough humility to know that I have no fucking clue what's going on,
Yeah.
you know? 30 years ago, I probably would have thought I really knew what was happening, and I'd be much more upset about it. I got an email today from a guy who's like, you know, I'm sure you get emails like this all the time from people who are like, look, this is impossible to tolerate. We can't, we need to wake people up. And you have a platform. So, I want to work with you to hone the message that we're going to use to wake people up and change the course and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, look, I appreciate the impetus behind that, but I don't I don't think anyone can wake up who isn't awake already. I don't think anything I say is going to change the course of fucking history, or, I feel like people are either receptive, in which case you can support them in their own journey, or they're not receptive, in which case, why waste your energy? There's nothing to do about it. So, what I said to this guy was like, I see myself as like someone on a ship. Nothing I do or say is going to change the course of this ship. I'm not the navigator, I'm not the captain. The ship's going to go where it is. So my job, or my role as I see it, is to observe, to comment, as a way to sort of comfort people who resonate with my perspective. But I don't feel like I don't have hope in the sense that, um, some fervent desire to change things. I see myself in a much more passive role in that sense, for better or worse, I guess. But it's more relaxing. So what gives me hope is that I live in the middle of nowhere. I'm surrounded by people I love and trust. We've got a month's worth of food in the freezer and a backup generator if the power goes out, and there's no one I'd rather be with to ride out the storm. And I kind of feel like that's about as good as it's going to get at this point. What
um,
about you? What gives you hope, if you have hope?
well, I just wanted to think about that metaphor for a second because, yeah, I mean, I can understand your perspective, and I sometimes feel like that also. And yeah, probably anything that we do isn't really going to make a difference. But if we, if we were on a ship and we knew the ship was headed for, an iceberg or something, in theory, we could alert the people. We could, go to the cabin. We could knock on the captain's door. We could, tie up the captain if he was a psychopath. We could redirect the ship. I mean, people could do
Yeah.
that, right? Like, why is that not possible? I mean, there
So
are
what?
people who, in this situation, like, why don't we have any agency to turn the ship in a different direction?
Well, in within the frame of the metaphor, what's the correlation to going to the captain's cabin? Like writing a letter to your senator?
That's where the metaphor does kind of break down a little bit.
I mean, we do have a psychopathic captain, but how are we going to get in there to tie him up, And then who's going to take over? I I mean, I feel like that what's happening in the US is the chickens coming home to roost, and I've been complaining about these chickens, since I became politically aware around 1980 or so. Um, the hypocrisy and the sort of self-aggrandizing ignorance of American culture, has been increasingly disturbing and absurd and unsustainable. And so I kind of feel like, the country that says we're the last bastion of decency and freedom and, everything that's good about civilization, at the same time that we're overthrowing freely elected governments all over the world and training their secret police and torture techniques, and funding the death squads in Central America, and assassinating Pinochet, and we could go on and on and on, right? So that kind of hypocrisy and behavior eventually bounces back at you if you believe in, geopolitical karma. And so when I see what's happening now, it's like, okay, well, we've been infiltrating foreign governments, deposing freely elected leaders, um, inserting our, Shah of Iran to run the country the way we want so that we can extract the resources. And now it's happening to us. It's fucked, but why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't the laws of geopolitical karma apply to us as well? I mean, I think the only explanation I can see for what Trump is doing is that he's a Russian asset, and he's everything he's doing is designed to make the world better for Russia and in some cases China and worse for us. And there's no,
Don't leave out the Saudis.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. The price
Um,
of oil is going down, so I'm not sure if that's helping the Saudis.
yeah.
But
Um,
I think
well,
they will attack Iran, which is helping the
yeah.
Saudis.
A problem with that metaphor, which I obviously also have thought about, yes, and somehow it's like our karma that's coming back or something. But unfortunately, the ones who are going to get massively injured and wiped out by this karmic rubber band are not like the perpetrators of all of this stuff, right? It's going to be the people, I mean, in some way, the indigenous people probably, but everybody else who's just like scuffling along. Whereas those of who with Wall Street fortunes and all that stuff are not. So I don't know. I don't know about the karma coming back to roost is really the accurate thing. I mean, unless there really was some kind of like deeper transformation, or I mean, yeah, it just seems like what's going to happen without some type of movement is further centralization and control of wealth and power, and many more people completely disenfranchised and almost like encouraged to die early or whatever, without vaccines, without healthcare. I'm sure you know about like Curtis Yarvin, who is one of Peter Thiel's main intellectuals, philosopher types. Thiel funded him for a while, but he's joked about how he feels that the best thing would be to turn the underclass into biodiesel for buses. Um, yeah.
Who's going to be on the bus?
I guess the new highly reproductive patriarchal white people who are going to start to have who are going to force their young wives to start having babies at the ages of 18 or whatever, so they can
Right,
keep them out of the working world. I guess I don't know.
right, right. Sweet.
Where did you grow up, Chris?
Um, I lived in Western Pennsylvania until I was 15 in a very rural working class area just north of Pittsburgh. And then my family moved to Fairfield, Connecticut, where I
Mhm.
lived for a couple of years. And then, yeah, and then I went to three different high schools. And then my senior year in high school was in upstate New York in a tiny little town in the Finger Lakes. So, yeah, Northeast. But I sort of experienced, I was always the new kid, which had interesting psychological repercussions. Um, and I sort of had the experience of being, like the brainiac in Pennsylvania, and then moving to Fairfield, where I was sort of like, definitely not among the
Mm.
top 5% of the students. It was like this very kind of
Yeah.
high end public school. So yeah, it was an interesting experience, and I saw different parts of the world, and I think it made me want to keep moving. So all through my 20s, I traveled all over the world. I hitchhiked to Alaska a couple times and worked on fishing boats up there, and you know, then was in Central America for a while and Asia, and just backpacking all over the world.
Nice. And I mainly encountered you through the Sex at Dawn book. So I don't know much about your like what was your writing career, or what had you been working on before that?
Well, I kind of like when I was in college, I went to college in upstate New York, and I was on a track to have a, intellectual professorial kind of life. And then I skipped my junior year. I found a loophole in the student handbook, and I figured out that I could skip my junior year. And after a little bit of struggle with the administration, they admitted I was right. And so that's when I went to Alaska. I hitchhiked to Alaska and got a job in a fish cannery that summer. And I had all sorts of adventures. I went to prison for 4 days, like a real prison, not a jail. I got picked up by all sorts of characters. It's kind of like what's the Into the Wild? I don't know
Mm.
if you've ever seen that film. That was kind of my trip. I was a few years older than Chris McCandless, so I sort of did had that kind of experience a few years before he did. But anyway, what happened, and I was also using psychedelics quite a bit in those days. And what happened was, I had a epiphany where I looked at these people who were picking me up, taking me home, feeding me, um, letting me sleep and on the sofa, and then driving me back out to the highway to be on my way the next day. And one woman took me out and bought me shoes because my shoes were falling apart, and she was like, "Come on, you need some new shoes." And they're just all these really wonderful, beautiful people who were so kind and generous to me. And I looked at my friends back at school who were all, very high IQ, PhD, professorial type people. And I realized that these people who were picking me up were inviting me into their lives, were non-judgmental, even though I was a very pedantic punk at that point. And um, but if the roles had been reversed and one of these people had fallen into my world back at college, my friends would have been disdainful, and they would have laughed at them. And I kind of had this moment where I was like, wait a minute, who am I on track to become here? Like my idea was I was going to go to Oxford, get a PhD, and then get a job teaching literature and be tenured by the time I was 30. That was the world I was trying to get into. And I had this experience on the way to Alaska, and I realized, like, that's not what I want to do. That's not who I want to be. I don't want to be someone talking about books. I want to be someone living. And so I made the decision not to commit myself to anything until I turned 30. And I was probably 19 or 20 at this time. And so I just said, okay, I'm not going to try to write anything. I'm not going to try to write a book. I'm not going to try to get a PhD. I'm not going to go to med school. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have any kids. I'm not going to make any lasting decisions until I'm 30. And I'm going to spend the next 10 years just floating around the world trying to figure out what the fuck's going on. And so that's what I did. Totally changed everything. And I always had this thing in the back of my head that I knew I was pretty good at writing. And my dad was a writer, and going through school, all my teachers were very encouraging, of that particular skill. And so I felt like this is something I could do someday. But I also felt like I don't want to write just because it's something I'm good at. I don't want to write. I don't want to be someone seeking attention. I only want to write if I actually have something to say. And at 26, I don't know. I have nothing to say. Um, so yeah, that was my idea. I didn't want to be John Updike. I wanted to be Herman Melville. I want
Mm.
to like come to it, or Joseph Conrad. I want to have a crazy life full of experiences and insights and characters. And then if I live through it and I get to be old, then I'll tell the stories. But I'm not going to be a 25-year-old trying to get published in the New Yorker because I've got a big
Yeah,
ego.
makes sense. So you went through that apprentice phase, and then finally you made your way back to writing, or what happened?
Yeah, well, what happened was I traveled through my 20s, lived all over the world, and then in my early 30s, started to feel like this isn't really doing it for me anymore. I was teaching English. I did all sorts of different jobs just to sort of, keep rolling. And I felt like this isn't really scratching my itch anymore. I'm going to need to think of some other way to make a living that's more intellectually challenging than talking about prepositions and pronouns. And anyway, long story short, I went to Findhorn. Have you been there?
I know about it. I've never been there.
Well, I went to Findhorn and I met people there who were had PhDs in psychology, but they had done their research on dreams or telepathy or plant intelligence or this all this freaky funky stuff. And I had no idea you could do that. I thought a PhD in psychology meant rats in a maze and statistics and stuff that I wasn't interested in. So when I met these people at Findhorn who had PhDs in psychology but who had done really interesting stuff, I thought, well, I could do that. Because if I get a PhD, that'll help me with whatever it is I decide to do, whether it's teaching or writing or whatever. Um, and so I went back to Barcelona where I was living at the time, and I wrote a letter to Andrew Weil. You know him,
Of course.
the doctor?
The natural
Yeah,
mind.
The Natural Mind, The Marriage of the
Yeah.
Sun and the Moon was one of my favorite books. And this was 91, maybe. So it's before he was uber famous. He
Yeah.
was he had done his books about consciousness, but he hadn't yet written the books, the whole sort of alternative
Mhm.
complementary health stuff that really blew him up and got him on Oprah and all that. Anyway, I wrote him a letter in the middle of the night, and basically I said, what you have done with medicine is what I would like to do with psychology, which is have a sort of multicultural um, arsenal that you can pull from different cultural traditions depending upon what the issue is that the person's bringing to you. So with Andrew Weil, it would be someone comes to you with a chronic skin condition, you might want to look at Ayurveda or diet or something like that. If someone, has a car accident, you go to allopathic emergency room, you deal with that. Or if it's, sleep disorder, you might want to look at stress and, different movement and all this. So to have a more holistic approach. Anyway, I sent him this letter thinking, I'll never hear from him. It's, he doesn't know me and he probably gets hundreds of letters from people. And a couple weeks later, I came home and there was a message on my answering machine like, hey, Chris, this is Andy Weil. I got your letter. Uh, Next time you're in California, let's have dinner, whatever. And we became friends. And so he kind of guided me a little bit on this, and I ended up going to graduate school in San Francisco, and yeah, I was working on a totally different PhD, um, and I read a book. I was working for an organization called Women in Community Service, which is a nonprofit working with homeless kids, and it was all women and me. It was like 30 some women, and I was the only guy. There was one gay guy and me were the only two men. So I was surrounded by all these like very assertive, embodied women, really smart women. And I read a book called The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, which was the first time I had come across this new discipline of evolutionary psychology, using evolution to explain behavioral and mental things
Mhm.
rather than just physiological things. And I was fascinated. It was like the Rosetta Stone. It was like, holy shit, this explains everything. This is why men are,
Mhm.
horny and chasing women all the time, and women are more selective, and all this kind of stuff, which later I came to see as a sort of a neo-Darwinian perspective, which I ended up disagreeing with. But initially, I thought it explained everything. It was so smart. But when I would talk to these women around me and say, like, look, this is why women want resources and they want a steady relationship with a man who's a provider, blah, blah, blah. And the women said to me, Chris, this is such a patriarchal bullshit perspective. I
Mm,
don't buy it. That's not why women have sex. We have sex because we love intimacy and it feels good. The same reason you
mm,
have sex. It's not
mm.
about these sort of economic considerations.
Yeah.
So that led me to go back and look at the research that Wright had used in the book, the original papers, because I was in grad school anyway. I had access to all the journals, and I went and I looked into this stuff, and it was like, wow, he didn't mention bonobos. He just talks
Mm,
about chimps. He doesn't even mention bonobos, which are female dominant, promiscuous, resource sharing, totally different thing. And then I looked at the hunter gatherer literature, and it's like, wait a minute, most hunter gatherers don't even know that sex causes pregnancy. Why would they be militantly, mate guarding and I started seeing how much was left out of this narrative. And so that led me to write my dissertation about human sexual behavior in prehistory, which then I expanded into Sex at Dawn. So I didn't really
nice.
get back into writing until my late 30s.
Hmm, hmm. And when you wrote Sexy Doll, you wrote it with a partner, right? Like it was you and
Yeah,
somebody
with
else. Yeah,
Casilda, my wife at the time, who is a
yeah,
psychiatrist from Mozambique. Yeah,
yeah. And when the book came out, I mean, I thought it was great, and I wrote about it in my book, How Soon Is Now, I believe. I visited this community in Portugal called Tamara, which I'm sure you've
yeah,
heard of, where they've tried to, Tamara was started by Germans who were born in like the late, the 40s after the sort of wreckage of the Second World War, and they were trying to. Then they grew up in the 60s. They saw these movements, sort of left and radical utopian ecological movements, sort of try to put things together and then kind of fail. So then they were left wondering, what's at the core of why these movements are not succeeding or these communities. And they realized that it was core issues around love, sexuality, and jealousy that ended up to creating these like cracks and fissures that broke everything apart. It's still very much like that. I mean, even I've just been involved with tangentially with a group who were building this very interesting nonprofit, and well, I guess one of the leaders of this nonprofit had kind of flirted with somebody, and that destroyed a lot of their work together. It's incredible how it's like dynamite right now. This whole issue. When did Sex at Dawn get published?
2010.
2010. Um, yeah. So I'm kind of curious. I know the book also. Well, maybe just for the people who don't know, what would you say is the basic thesis of the book? And then maybe I just ask you a question or two.
I guess the thesis is that human sexuality was co-opted from a purely reproductive function to a social function, pretty deep, pretty far back in our evolutionary past. And so we're one of the only species that has sex when the female cannot get pregnant. So it's not primarily about reproduction. It's about establishing and maintaining interdependent social groups like our hunter gatherer ancestors evolved in.
And there was kind of the right, this whole question of whether we, which I read about in some other books, so whether we evolved from the chimps or the bonobos or something in between, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, we evolved from the last common ancestor of humans, chimps, and bonobos was about 7 million years ago, 5 to 7 million years ago. And then the two lines split. One line became hominids, Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon, all the different hominids. And then the other line split into chimps and bonobos. So
Yeah,
we didn't evolve from either, right? Like
got it, got it, got it.
we all
I
had a
see.
common ancestor. Yeah.
But I mean, I think I was the book Demonic Males. You probably read that book,
Oh,
where they talked.
God.
What's
Yeah, I
that?
hate that book.
Oh, really? Well, but wasn't it the idea that the chimps and the bonobos were on opposite sides of the river, and because they had slightly different access to different food sources, the chimps developed kind of aggressive alpha male kind of like model of organization, whereas in the bonobo community, women we're able to like be more together, and somehow it created a more harmonic, and then sex used for positive adhesion and kind of like everybody connecting in that way. But they argue that it was different food sources or different environmental factors that created this. Is that something you
Yeah.
understand, or?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that argument, but the argument doesn't really make any sense as far as I'm concerned.
Mm,
Yeah, the chimps and bonobos are on opposite sides of the Congo River.
yeah,
That's true. And the argument, I think it's Richard Wrangham who wrote that book, or maybe
yeah,
co-authored it with someone else. Yeah. The argument is that okay, on one side of the river, the chimps had to compete with gorillas and other primates for some of the same food sources, whereas on the bonobo side of the river, they didn't have gorillas and other competition. But that ignores basic evolutionary theory, which is that if you have a surplus food supply and no competition, the population of the species that relies on that food supply is going to very quickly balloon to the point where they're facing the same competitive pressures as any other species, right? Like
mm,
if you have 100 banana trees and 20 bonobos, like in a couple of generations, you're going to have 100 bonobos the same as you would on the other side of the river. So the
mm,
idea that some passing lack of competition for food resulted in this social behavior really doesn't make any sense.
I see.
Um,
Okay.
which isn't to say I have a better theory.
Yeah.
But that theory really fails on basic terms. There's a really interesting story that Robert Sapolsky tells. You're familiar with him, I imagine.
Yeah, remind me again, what was his main, I think it was,
He's a primatologist, but he's best known
mm,
as a neuroscientist. He teaches at Stanford. He's written a whole bunch of books.
mm.
Behave, I think, is one of his most
Okay, got
recent
it. Yeah, yeah,
books.
yeah. Right. Okay, got it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
He's a really, really interesting thinker.
Mm,
But anyway, he studied stress in baboons for
yeah.
20 or 30 years in Kenya. And he tells this great story about how, he had sort of every summer he went and studied the same troop of baboons. And so he had seen generations after generation come through. And baboons are very aggressive and male dominant, nasty, uh, violent. And so one year he came back and the Kenyans had built a tourist hotel not far from this troop of baboons that he studies, and the troop had taken over the dump where the hotel dumped their kitchen scraps and stuff. And so one time they dumped some food, some meat that was tainted with tuberculosis, I think it was,
Mm,
and of course the meat scraps were um, fought over by the dominant males, and the dominant males would keep them for themselves, and the beta
hmm.
males and the
Yeah,
females and the babies wouldn't get any. So this stuff was poison. So all the dominant males died suddenly,
yeah.
and it happened while he was there observing them. And what he saw was that once these asshole males were removed from the society, this baboon troop became very peaceful and relaxed and just chill. Like he'd never seen a baboon troop that was so chill and kind to one another, right? Because these
Mm,
dominant males had been removed and they were the ones causing all the problems. So he thought, well, that's all great now, but next year when I come here, it's going to be a fucking bloodbath because the dominant males, what happens with baboons is when the males reach sexual maturity, they're sort of driven out of the group they were born into, and they have to go find another group to infiltrate and, start at the bottom of the totem pole there and work their way up. And so what's going to happen is all these young aggressive males are going to
yeah.
come and there won't be any dominant males to like keep them in check or defend. So it's just going to be, raping and pillaging here. So he comes back the next year expecting the worst, and what he finds is that indeed there were new males in this group who had come in from neighboring groups, but they were all chill and relaxed as well. And so that he's like, wait, so they developed this cultural tradition of kindness, and the new males came in and they adopted the tradition rather than taking over. And so it becomes this. You ask me what gives me hope. This story gives me hope. And he's gone back. I talked with him 5 or 6 years ago, and I asked him, like, what's going on with this troop? And he said they're still chill. They're still
Yeah.
relaxed. The other males come in, they've joined the group, and they learn, like, oh, okay, everybody just relaxes here. I don't need to fight. I don't need to attack anybody. We all just kind of hang out and we're good. So there is some sort of, I think there's an overpowering capacity for kindness and egalitarianism in primate species that can even overpower the default behavioral patterns.
Yeah, well, that's ultimately what you explored in the book. I know you looked at a range of different, cultures, indigenous and modern cultures, and you noted that there were some that had a much higher degree of sexual freedom or more relaxed morals. I remember like there was like an indigenous Chinese culture where the young
Mm,
women had a huge degree of sexual freedom and so on.
yeah, the
Um,
Mosuo. Yeah,
did you
yeah, they're
visit them, or that was
fascinating.
just yeah?
No, no, I didn't visit them.
Mm.
I read memoir of a woman who was raised there, and anthropological reports. They're really interesting because Marco Polo passed through there and wrote about them.
Yeah,
Back in 14, whatever that was. So their system has been around for a long time, and it's a system that's particularly interesting from an evolutionary perspective because the sort of conventional mainstream thinkers in this field, the Steven Pinkers and the Richard Dawkins and those guys, they would say that this kind of society should not exist because their view is that males are by nature um, vigilant and jealous and want to control women's sexual to assure their paternity, right? And that so why would I take care of a woman if I'm not sure that those children are mine? So it's natural that I control her behavior to make sure those are that I'm investing in my own DNA. That's the sort of
yeah,
standard view. But the Mosuo, the father, the biological father, has nothing to do with raising the children. The children are raised by the mother and her sisters and her brothers. And so the sexual interactions are unrelated to the nuclear family configurations. And there's no expectation of any kind of continuity or resource sharing or anything else with the biological father.
right. Isn't there a bit of an issue though? I don't know if that's the case in this case, but I mean, I'm thinking of the Margaret Mead story. I don't remember. I don't remember if you wrote. We have a sort of an idea of something we want. I mean, a lot of anthropology it ends up being a little bit more like wish fulfillment or projection. So wasn't it the case that Margaret Mead, like, believed she'd found this like sexually utopian, free loving community? Wasn't it like Samoa or something? But
Samoa,
then
Samoa.
it turned out that actually she'd misinterpreted what was going on and misunderstood. And later on, people
Well,
were like, well, actually, it was
it's a really complicated thing because so she wrote Coming of Age in Samoa in the 1920s.
yeah.
Um, and part of that story was the sort of sexual freedom of Samoan teenagers and lack of shame and guilt around sexual expression, right? Then, after she had written that book, waves of Christian missionaries arrived in Samoa and sort of indoctrinated the people in the shame and guilt of Christianity and, relative to
Oh,
sexuality.
okay. Hmm.
And then a guy named Freeman, I forget his name, an Australian guy named Freeman, he went to Samoa, I think in the 60s, And this is, 30, 35 years of Christian indoctrination later. And he interviewed some of the older women who had been teenagers that were interviewed by Margaret Mead. And some of these now women in their 60s and 70s were saying, "Oh, no, we didn't fuck around. Oh no, that's not
Mm,
true." Okay, but that's like, interview your grandmother about what a wild chick she was, 40 years ago. She might deny it, right? Especially if she's found Jesus in the meantime.
mm,
And and then, if you look into this debunking of Margaret Mead, it turns out that this guy Freeman, I think he was gay and he was sleeping with all these Samoan boys. So while
mm.
he was debunking the freedom of the, heterosexual teenagers as reported by Margaret Mead 40 years earlier, he was up to all sorts of stuff with adolescent boys in Samoa, to the point
Yeah,
where the Samoans kicked him out and said he can never come back. He was, kicked out of Samoa and not welcome to ever return. So there are layers of debunking on debunking, and and as you say, personal agendas get mixed into all this stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, anthropology is very amenable to that kind of stuff, and I freely admit that I came at this with an agenda myself, right? That I mean, I had gone around the world and looked at all, sort of very interested in how sexuality happens and how it's conceived of in different cultures. And one of the things I realized pretty early on is that it's what we're told is human nature is our version of human nature,
yeah,
right? Like I'm sure you're familiar with Joseph Campbell's concept of detribalization. And so, the idea that we're all in a tribe and that tribe has belief systems, and but every tribe in, inculcates the idea that our belief systems are the way it is, right? Like Navajo means the people, Apache means the people, Lakota means the people. Everybody thinks they're the people and everyone else is weird. Um, so I came at this with a very open to the idea that what I had been told and what the conventional wisdom is about sexuality is deeply suspect.
yeah. Well, I wanted to skip ahead a little bit and bring it around to today a little bit. I'm curious. Do you know the work of Warren Farrell? Oops, has he frozen on me here? Do you know the
Warren
work of Warren
Farrell, yeah,
Farrell? The myth of
yeah.
male power. He's got a very interesting analysis. I mean, I guess what it seems like has happened in the last 30 years, I guess. I mean, yes, the US has continued to be an empire and has, caused war and assaulted other regions of the world, but internally, Western European and American society has been quite peaceful, and also technology has advanced a lot, and that's ultimately seems to have advanced women a great deal, to the point where in the last years in the US, I think it's like 60 or 70% of college graduates are women, and women are excelling more than men in like entrepreneurial and even like corporate jobs and so on,
Mm.
even if the men still have a sort of hold on like the top of the pyramid. Um, yeah, and obviously we had the sexual revolution in the 60s, which you look at it from different ways, but it feels like part of what's happened with this Trump situation and the sort of the sort of men's sort of infuriated, like the incels, the men's movement behind it. It's kind of like partially motivated by yeah, kind of like a desire to level the score against women, or like win back some kind of ground that's been lost. And yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to like analyze, what how that's undergo, how that's happening and what's the truth of the situation. I don't know if you know Louise Perry's book. Am I still breaking up, or am I better?
It's breaking up a lot.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
And there's a
Mm.
delay between the video and the
Like, well,
audio too. But I'm hearing most of what you're saying. Yeah, Louise Perry's book about how the sexual revolution kind of has been detrimental to women. I'm familiar with that.
yes. I mean, yeah. So yeah, I'm just kind of curious how you um, analyze the current situation, and partially what I'm interested in is having the proper analysis and diagnosis, then to think about what can be done, because it feels like yeah, there's a big dominance of the right wing media right now, and these types of figures of kind of like, I mean, obviously Trump, RFK. Um, uh, yeah, okay. Well, we're gonna have to wrap up soon anyway. Maybe we can come back to this another time. Maybe that's enough, although it's not exactly a question. What are you sort of feeling about the current situation? Did you see any, particularly around gender roles and sexuality, as it relates to the work you already did? And yeah, just that's kind of the question.
Yeah, well, it's I think that what's going on in the United States is quite different from what's going on in a lot of other parts of the world. I lived in Spain for 20 years, and yeah, there's much less anxiety around sex roles, around sexual identity, pronouns. A lot of the strife in the United States is very much, I think, limited to this culture. Maybe Australia and England a bit, but I think it's pretty much the U.S. Um, I feel like my sense of the U.S. is that, I often think of a friend of mine in Spain, a doctor I used to hang out with a lot, Dr. Rubio. And one time we were talking about American culture, and he said, Chris, the thing about your culture is you Americans, you have no sense of the ridiculous. And he said that's a positive and a negative. Like, you have these incredibly creative, free spirits, Jim Morrison and the Doors, or, like Jimi Hendrix or whatever. Like, you have this unrestrained creativity, which is really amazing and beautiful. But on the other hand, you have all the mass murderers, and you have all these, like, the Mansons and this crazy, like, you guys just push it too far all the time. And I kind of feel
Mm.
like there's a lot of wisdom in that. And like you were talking about Warren Farrell, and you were breaking up a bit, but if I understood, you were talking about, like, there's sort of a sense of retribution or something, with women gaining more access to, resources or education or whatever. And I feel like we tend to do this. The pendulum just swings too far. Instead of
Mm.
coming to the center, we're talking about, you've got Ta-Nehisi Coates on one side saying, we should pay reparations to all black people for what happened 100 years ago. And then on the other side, you've got, neo Nazis marching in the streets. And it's like, why can we not come to a reasonable position in the center? Why does it have to always be swinging back and forth so much? So yeah, I feel like there are good things that are happening in the US. I think, the whole sort of Me Too movement. I was listening to an interview with Werner Herzog a few days ago, and he was talking about how movie sets have changed, and women they feel much more sort of liberated to complain if somebody's hassling them, or whatever. But on the other hand, if there's a scene where two people kiss, you have to have intimacy coaches on the set, It's like, what the fuck? Why can't we just be adults? Why it feels like this country is just so adolescent. Um, so yeah, I feel like, there are important things that are happening. I just wish we could get to the commonsensical, moderate position without all the destruction on both ends.
Hmm.
You know, a lot of innocent people got swept up in the Me Too thing and had their lives destroyed. There was a guy, a doctor, I remember of example, really broke my heart. This guy's a psychiatrist. He taught at Columbia University Medical School, very respected. He's in his 60s or 70s. And there was a photograph on Instagram of a model from Sudan or Ethiopia or something. Very, very dark skinned black woman, very beautiful woman. And she was famous in the modeling world. They called her like the African queen or something like that because she was like so dark skinned and just, you know, beautiful features and all that. Anyway, there was a photograph of her sitting on a bed with white sheets, white wall, everything white behind her. So it's obviously the photograph is meant to accentuate how dark she is, you know, this overexposed and all that. And people were commenting on, you know, oh, she's so beautiful. And this guy said, whether he commented on Instagram, he said, whether a freak of nature or not, this is certainly a very beautiful woman. He got fired from his position. He got kicked out of Columbia, can't teach there anymore, got kicked out of his practice where he had a shared practice with other psychiatrists because he called this woman a freak. But all he said was a freak of nature, right?
Yeah.
Like a guy who's 7'4" is a freak of nature. That's not an insult. All it means is that someone's not, you know, a typical example of a given class. I mean, things like that are just so ridiculous and just would not happen in the other cultures that I'm familiar with. It's a very American overreaction to things. So anyway, I just wish I see the value in these things. I just wish we could find a way to move more rapidly to the resolution, which is moderation, the middle of the road, the middle way, you know?
That doesn't seem to be where we're at right now, Chris.
That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. But you know, what is it? What was the line from Churchill? Like the Americans always do the right thing after they've tried everything else. I I feel like he's got it, you know?
If
Yeah.
we'll see if that continues to be the case.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, it's the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep you longer than is good for you. Thanks for making the time. I think we should do this again. I sort of didn't quite get to where I wanted to get to, but it was a little bit nebulous, so I apologize for that. Maybe we'll try again.
No, no,
At some
let's
point.
do it again for sure.
Very
I
cool. Yeah,
always
yeah,
enjoy talking with you, man.
yeah. Great to hang out. Yeah, yeah. Okay, everybody. Thanks for being with us, and
Thanks.
on with the show. Yeah.
All right. Ciao.
Ciao, ciao.